6 disturbing urban explorer stories from abandoned asylums. These 6 first-hand stories recount chilling encounters that will make you think twice before stepping inside abandoned places. Story number 1, by Jason Miller. It was just after midnight when I arrived. The massive, crumbling structure loomed against the night sky, its broken windows and graffiti-covered walls adding to its sinister atmosphere. I slipped through a gap in the rusted fence, my flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The air inside the asylum felt heavy, like the building itself was holding its breath. The first few rooms were eerily quiet. Old, rusted bed frames lay scattered across the floors, and piles of crumbling plaster covered patient records and abandoned medical equipment. I snapped a few pictures, fascinated by how time had ravaged the place. But as I ventured deeper, I started to feel off. The silence became oppressive, and the shadows seemed to move at the edges of my vision. As I reached the patient wards, my flashlight beam caught something unusual, scratch marks on the walls. They were deep and erratic, as if someone had clawed at the plaster in desperation. Above one bed, scrawled in faded red paint, were the words, "They're still here." A chill ran down my spine, but I convinced myself it was just the work of some overzealous graffiti artist. I continued down the long, decaying hallway, my footsteps echoing unnaturally. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the corridor, a shadowy figure stood motionless, its shape unmistakably human, but somehow wrong. It was too tall, too narrow, and it didn't sway or shift like a person would. It was as if it were watching me. "Hey!" I called out, trying to mask the fear creeping into my voice. "Is someone there?" The figure didn't respond. My flashlight flickered as I cautiously stepped closer, its beam weak against the oppressive darkness. Just as I was about to call out again, the shadow moved, not walking, but gliding silently into a side room. My heart raced as I debated whether to follow it. Every rational part of me screamed to leave, but curiosity won out. When I stepped into the room, it was empty. The only things inside were an overturned chair, a broken mirror, and a rusted sink. The air was freezing, and I could see my breath clouding in front of me. That's when I noticed the mirror. It was cracked, its jagged surface distorting the reflection, but I could clearly see a shape behind me, a tall, shadowy figure standing in the doorway. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my hand, but the doorway was empty. The shadow was gone. My pulse thundered in my ears as I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. But then, the chair began to rock. It started slowly, creaking back and forth, as if someone had just risen from it. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. The mirror suddenly shattered, the sound deafening in the silent room. Shards of glass scattered across the floor, and I bolted out of there, my panic drowning out any thought of caution. As I ran down the hallway, the oppressive silence was broken by faint whispers. They were coming from all around me, low and unintelligible, growing louder with every step. I didn't dare look back. The hallway seemed endless, but finally, I found the opening in the fence and scrambled out into the night air. Even as I sat in my car, trying to catch my breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I reviewed the photos on my camera later, my stomach dropped. In one of the last shots of the hallway, the shadowy figure was there, faint but unmistakable, standing just behind a doorway. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in Byberry. I haven't been back, and I don't plan to. Whatever was in that building wasn't just a trick of the light. It was real, and it wanted me to know I wasn't welcome. Some places are haunted not just by memories, but by the lingering presence of something far darker. Story number 2, by Sarah Parker. In 2021, my friends and I decided to explore Forest Haven Asylum, an abandoned mental institution in Maryland, with a horrifying history. Forest Haven was once a facility for individuals with intellectual disabilities, but it became infamous for abuse, neglect, and patient deaths. It was finally shut down in 1991, but the stories of its dark past lingered, and so did rumors of hauntings. We thought we were prepared for whatever we might encounter. We were wrong. We arrived at dusk, the crumbling buildings cloaked in shadows. The asylum looked like it had been frozen in time, with ivy climbing the walls and broken windows gaping like empty eyes. The air was thick and humid, and as we walked through the overgrown grounds, an eerie silence settled over us, as if the place were holding its breath. The first building we entered was the medical wing. The hallways were lined with rusted gurneys and overturned filing cabinets, their contents spilling across the floor. Patient records, yellowed with age, detailed treatments like electroshock therapy and restraints. One file I picked up described a patient who had died from aspiration pneumonia due to improper feeding. The cold, clinical language made my stomach churn. These weren't just files, they were people's lives reduced to paperwork. As we moved deeper into the asylum, we came across a large, dimly lit room that appeared to be a recreation area. The walls were covered in faded murals, smiling suns, and happy children that felt painfully out of place in such a grim environment. A rusted wheelchair sat in the corner, its wheels caked with grime. I snapped a photo, the flash illuminating the room for a split second. Then we heard it, a faint, high-pitched scream. It echoed down the hall, cutting through the silence like a blade. We froze, our flashlights darting around the room. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. My friends nodded, their faces pale. The scream came again, louder this time, and closer. "Maybe it's an animal," one of my friends suggested, though his voice was unconvincing. We decided to investigate, following the sound down a long corridor. The farther we went, the colder it became. I could see my breath fogging in the beam of my flashlight, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. We reached a stairwell leading to the basement, where the screams seemed to originate. As we descended, the air grew heavier, and the faint sound of footsteps joined the screams. My heart pounded in my chest as we stepped into a narrow hallway lined with storage rooms. The walls were damp, and the smell of mildew was almost overpowering. At the end of the hallway was a large steel door. It was slightly ajar, and the screams seemed to be coming from inside. "We shouldn't go in there," I said, but my friends were already pushing the door open. The room beyond was pitch black, and as we shone our flashlights inside, the beams caught something that made my blood run cold. Scratch marks covering the walls, as if someone, or something, had been clawing to get out. Then the door slammed shut behind us, plunging us into darkness. The screams stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. "Who's there?" one of my friends shouted, his voice cracking. There was no response, just the sound of heavy breathing that seemed to come from all around us. Panic set in as we fumbled with the door, trying to force it open. It felt like something was holding it closed, an invisible force keeping us trapped. The growling grew louder, almost deafening, and I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder. I screamed, turning around, but there was nothing there. Finally, the door flew open on its own, and we stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. We didn't stop running until we were back outside, the asylum looming behind us like a dark spectre. As we caught our breath, one of my friends noticed something strange. "You're back," he said, pointing at me. I turned around, and he took a photo with his phone. There were 3 long red scratches running down my shoulder blade, as if I'd been clawed. I don't know what we encountered in Forest Haven that night, but I haven't been able to forget it. The screams, the growling, the scratches, they felt like a warning, a message from whatever still lingers in that place. Forest Haven isn't just abandoned, It's alive, and it doesn't want visitors. Story number 3. By Ben Harlow. In 2018, my friend Jake and I decided to explore the abandoned Norwich State Hospital in Connecticut. The sprawling complex of decaying buildings had been closed since 1996, but it was infamous for its dark history of overcrowding, experimental treatments, and patient abuse. The locals whispered about ghosts, but I didn't believe in the paranormal. I thought it would just be an adventure, a chance to see history frozen in time. I had no idea how wrong I was. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was starting to set. The hospital loomed before us, its broken windows and ivy-covered walls giving it an otherworldly, almost menacing appearance. We found an open basement window and climbed inside. The air was thick and musty, carrying the scent of mildew and decay. It was eerily quiet, with only the occasional creak of the building settling. As we made our way through the labyrinth of hallways, the sheer size of the hospital became overwhelming. Each room told a story. Rusted bed frames, torn mattresses, and old medical equipment lay scattered everywhere. In one room, we found a pile of patient records. I picked one up and read it aloud. Patient 1347, diagnosed with schizophrenia. Treatment, lobotomy. The stark, clinical language made my stomach turn. About an hour in, we reached the upper floors of one of the main buildings. The light was fading fast, and our flashlights cast long, flickering shadows on the walls. We entered what appeared to be a common room. The windows here were large and let in just enough moonlight to see the outlines of chairs and tables. It was there that I first noticed her. At the far end of the room, standing outside one of the broken windows, was a woman. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her dark hair fell in messy strands over her shoulders. She wore a long, tattered dress that looked like it was from another century. She wasn't moving, just standing there, staring in. "Jake, do you see her?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He turned to look but shook his head. "See who?" he asked, frowning. I pointed toward the window, but when I looked back, she was gone. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but I couldn't shake the unease that crept over me. We decided to keep moving, exploring room after room, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Every so often, I thought I caught a glimpse of her in the corner of my eye, a fleeting shadow, a flicker of movement. But whenever I turned to look, she wasn't there. Things took a turn when we entered a small patient room on the 3rd floor. The walls were covered in faint scratch marks, and the bed in the corner looked as though it had been untouched for decades. I noticed something unusual about the window. It was shut, unlike most of the others we had seen. When I shone my flashlight on the glass, I froze. There, on the inside of the window pane, were handprints. They were small, as if made by a woman, and they appeared to be smeared, as though someone had been pressing against the glass from the outside. My breath caught in my throat. We were 3 stories up. Jake finally started to believe me. "Let's just get out of here," he said, his voice shaking. We made our way back toward the stairs, but as we passed by the common room again, I stopped dead in my tracks. She was back. This time, she was inside the building, standing at the far end of the room. Her pale face was turned toward us, her dark eyes locked onto mine. She didn't move, but the air grew colder with every passing second. "We have to go. Now," I whispered, grabbing Jake's arm. We bolted down the stairs, the sound of our footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. As we neared the exit, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a soft tapping, like fingernails on glass. I glanced over my shoulder and saw her standing in a window near the entrance, her hand pressed against the glass. We didn't stop running until we were back at the car. As we sped away, I looked back one last time. For a split second, I saw her standing in one of the upper windows, watching us leave. She didn't follow, but the feeling of her eyes on me stayed long after we had driven away. I haven't been back to Norwich State Hospital since that night. Whatever we saw wasn't just a trick of the light or our imaginations. It was something real, something that didn't want us there. I still dream about her sometimes, the woman in the window, her dark eyes staring right through me. And every time, I wake up with the same question. Who was she, and why does she haunt that place? Story number 4, by Ethan Collins. In 2020, my brother Liam and I decided to explore the infamous Peat Island Mental Hospital in New South Wales, Australia. The hospital, built in 1911, had been abandoned for over a decade, but its dark history of mistreatment and abuse had turned it into a magnet for urban explorers and thrill seekers. Among all the stories we'd heard, Ward 4 was the most notorious, said to be the place where the most difficult patients were confined. Some people claimed it was haunted by the spirits of those who had suffered and died there. We thought it was just a creepy tale to keep people away. We arrived just before sunset. The island was eerily quiet, the stillness broken only by the distant cries of seabirds. The main building loomed ahead, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. A rusted sign reading Ward 4 pointed us toward a separate structure near the edge of the property. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine, but I shook it off and led the way. The door to Ward 4 creaked loudly as we pushed it open, revealing a long, narrow hallway lined with small cell-like rooms. Most of the doors were ajar, and inside we could see rusted bed frames and torn mattresses. Restraints still dangled from some of the beds, a haunting reminder of the hospital's past. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and decay, and every step we took echoed unnaturally in the confined space. We began exploring the rooms, finding old medical charts and broken equipment scattered across the floors. In one room, we discovered a journal tucked beneath a rotting pillow. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but the handwriting was still legible. The entries spoke of isolation, fear, and something that sent a chill down my spine. I hear the children laughing at night. They're not real. They can't be real. I handed the journal to Liam, and we exchanged uneasy glances. It's just someone losing their mind, he said, but his voice wavered. We decided to keep moving. As we made our way deeper into the ward, we heard it, a faint, childlike giggle. It echoed through the hallway, soft at first, but growing louder. My heart pounded in my chest as I spun around, shining my flashlight down the corridor. It was empty. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Liam nodded, his face pale. The giggling stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, rhythmic creaking sound. It was coming from one of the rooms at the far end of the hall. We hesitated, but curiosity got the better of us. As we approached, the creaking grew louder, and I realized it was the sound of a rocking chair. When we reached the room, my flashlight beam landed on an old wooden rocking chair in the corner. It was moving back and forth, the creaking deafening in the silence. But the room was empty. No wind, no one inside, just the chair, rocking on its own. Liam grabbed my arm. "We need to leave. Now." Before we could turn back, the door to the room slammed shut, trapping us inside. My flashlight flickered, and the temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath fogging in the air as the giggling returned, now louder and more menacing. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere, surrounding us. The rocking chair suddenly stopped, and the room fell silent. Then, a soft voice broke through the stillness. "Why are you here?" I froze, too terrified to move. Liam was frantically trying to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The voice came again, this time louder, angrier. "You shouldn't be here." The flashlight in my hand died, plunging us into darkness. I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder, and I screamed, stumbling back. Finally, the door flew open, and we bolted out of the room, sprinting down the hallway without looking back. As we reached the exit, I heard the voice one last time, a whisper that chilled me to my core. Don't come back. When we made it outside, we didn't stop running until we were back at the dock where we'd left our boat. I glanced back at the building, and for a split second, I saw a shadowy figure standing in the window of Ward 4, watching us. I haven't been back to Pete Island since that night, and I never will. Whatever we encountered in Ward 4 wasn't just a figment of our imagination. It was real, and it wanted us gone. Some places are better left untouched, their histories buried along with the spirits that refuse to let go. Story number 5, by Megan Rivers. In 2019, my boyfriend Ryan and I decided to explore the infamous Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in western West Virginia. The massive asylum, which opened in 1864 and closed in 1994, had become a hotspot for ghost hunters and urban explorers like us. Its dark history was filled with tales of overcrowding, abuse, and experimental treatments, including the notorious lobotomies performed by Dr. Walter Freeman. While I wasn't a huge believer in the paranormal, I was curious, and maybe a little too confident in my skepticism. We arrived at sunset, the fading light casting eerie shadows over the building's Gothic facade. The asylum loomed like a fortress of forgotten pain, its windows dark and lifeless. We had signed up for an overnight tour that allowed limited exploration of the more intact areas, but we had other plans. Once inside, we quietly slipped away from the group, venturing into the basement where visitors weren't supposed to go. The basement was dark and suffocatingly silent, the only light coming from our flashlights. The air was damp, and the smell of mildew was overwhelming. As we descended the creaking staircase, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Ryan tried to make light of it, joking that we'd probably run into rats before ghosts, but even he seemed uneasy. The hallway at the bottom of the stairs was long and narrow, lined with rusted doors that led to what we assumed were storage rooms. As we walked, the beam of my flashlight caught something strange. Deep scratch marks gouged into the walls, like someone had desperately clawed at them. I shivered but kept moving. About halfway down the hallway we heard it, a faint, high-pitched scream. It was distant, almost too soft to hear, but it sent a chill through me. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Ryan nodded, his face pale. We stopped to listen, and the scream came again, louder this time, and unmistakably human. "Maybe it's part of a ghost tour," Ryan said, though he didn't sound convinced. We decided to follow the sound, turning down another corridor that led to a large, rusted steel door. The screams seemed to be coming from behind it. My heart was pounding as Ryan pushed it open, the heavy door creaking loudly on its hinges. The room beyond was massive, with low ceilings and rows of metal shelving that were mostly empty, save for a few old medical supplies and what looked like patient restraints. The screams had stopped, replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence. The air was freezing, and I could see my breath in the beam of my flashlight. "Let's take a quick look and get out of here," Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper. As we stepped farther into the room, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like something was watching us. Then, out of nowhere, the screams started again, this time deafeningly loud, echoing all around us. It sounded like multiple voices crying out in agony, overlapping and blending into a horrifying cacophony. Ryan grabbed my arm. "We need to go, now." But before we could move, the metal shelving on the far side of the room toppled over, crashing to the ground with a deafening bang. The sound echoed, and then came the heavy thud of footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching us from the darkness. "Who's there?" Ryan shouted, shining his flashlight toward the sound. There was no response, just the steady, relentless thudding of footsteps coming closer. My flashlight flickered and went out, plunging us into near total darkness. I could barely see Ryan, but I could feel him gripping my arm tightly. Then, a low, guttural growl reverberated through the room, so close it felt like it was right next to me. I froze, too terrified to breathe. The footsteps stopped, replaced by the sound of labored breathing, as if something, or someone, was standing just inches away. "Run!" Ryan shouted, yanking me toward the door. We sprinted back down the hallway, our footsteps echoing wildly. The screams followed us, growing louder and more frantic with each step. When we reached the staircase, I swear I felt a cold hand brush against my back, pushing me forward. I stumbled but didn't stop, climbing the stairs two at a time until we were back in the main building. We didn't stop running until we were outside, gasping for air under the night sky. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. "What the hell was that?" Ryan asked, his face pale. I had no answer. All I could think about was the footsteps and the growl, the way it felt like something was chasing us. Later, I learned that the basement of Trans-Allegheny was used as a storage area for the bodies of patients who had died, waiting to be buried in the nearby cemetery. Some say their spirits still linger, trapped by the pain and suffering they endured in life. I don't know what we encountered that night, but I'll never forget the sound of those screams or the icy touch on my back. It felt like a warning, a message that we were trespassing somewhere we didn't belong. I haven't gone back to Trans-Allegheny, and I don't plan to. Some places are haunted not just by history, but by the souls who refuse to leave. Story number 6, by James Carter. In 2022, my sister Amanda and I decided to explore the abandoned Willard Asylum for the chronic insane in New York. The asylum, which had operated from 1869 to 1995, had a reputation for being one of the most haunted places in the state. Over 50,000 patients had passed through its doors, and many of them never left, buried in unmarked graves in the asylum's cemetery. The thought of venturing into such a place thrilled us at first, but nothing could have prepared us for what we encountered. We arrived on a cloudy afternoon, the sky casting a dull grey light over the sprawling complex. The buildings were enormous, their brick facades covered in ivy and grime. We found an open door leading into one of the main buildings and stepped inside, our footsteps echoing in the silence. The air was thick and musty, carrying the unmistakable scent of mildew and decay. The first floor was relatively uneventful, just empty hallways, crumbling walls, and rusted furniture. We found old medical charts scattered across the floor, many of them detailing treatments that were horrific by today's standards: lobotomies, isolation, and electroshock therapy. It was unsettling, but we pressed on, our curiosity outweighing our unease. Things changed when we reached the second floor. The atmosphere felt heavier, almost oppressive, and the temperature dropped noticeably. As we walked down the hallway, I noticed a small wooden chair sitting in one of the rooms. It was a child's chair, out of place among the decaying medical equipment. I felt a chill as I approached it. The chair looked perfectly preserved, as if someone had placed it there recently. "Do you think they treated kids here?" Amanda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, but something about the chair unsettled me. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong. As we continued down the hall, I heard it, a faint giggle. It was soft and distant, but unmistakable. I froze, shining my flashlight in every direction. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Amanda nodded, her face pale. The giggle came again, louder this time, echoing down the corridor. It sounded like a child playing, but there was an edge to it that made my skin crawl. We followed the sound, which led us to a room at the far end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, my flashlight illuminated a single stuffed bear sitting in the center of the floor. Its fur was matted and torn, and one of its button eyes was missing. Amanda stepped closer, but I grabbed her arm. "Don't," I said, my voice trembling. The bear suddenly tipped over on its own, as if someone had pushed it. The giggle returned, now coming from all around us. My heart was racing, and I could feel the sweat on my palms. "Let's get out of here," I said, pulling Amanda toward the door. Before we could leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The giggles turned into sobs, faint at first but growing louder, until it sounded like a child crying in the corner of the room. I swung my flashlight around, but there was nothing there. Then, clear as day, a small voice spoke. "Why did you leave me?" Amanda screamed, and I felt my legs turn to jelly. I grabbed the door handle and yanked it open, dragging her out of the room. We sprinted down the hallway, the sound of footsteps following close behind us. I didn't dare look back. When we reached the stairs, I stumbled and nearly fell, but Amanda caught me. We bolted out of the building and didn't stop running until we were back at the car. As we climbed in, gasping for air, Amanda pointed toward one of the windows on the second floor. "Do you see that?" she whispered. I looked up and saw it, a small figure standing in the window, barely visible in the fading light. It looked like a child, but its features were indistinct, almost blurred. I could feel its gaze on us as we sped away. Later, I researched the asylum and learned that children were occasionally admitted there, often abandoned by families who couldn't care for them. Many of them died in the asylum, their deaths unrecorded, their graves unmarked. I still think about that voice, the giggle, and the figure in the window. Was it one of the children who had been forgotten by history, trapped in the place where they had suffered? I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to. Willard Asylum is more than just a relic of the past. It's a place where the pain and sorrow of its former residents linger. I'll never go back, and I'll never forget the forgotten child who called out to us that day. And that concludes 6 disturbing urban explorer stories from abandoned asylums. These chilling accounts remind us that some places hold on to their pain and suffering long after they've been abandoned. Whether it's echoes of the past, lingering spirits, or something more sinister, these asylums are not for the faint of heart. Which story gave you the biggest chills? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-tingling tales. Until next time, stay curious, but tread carefully. Some doors are better left unopened.